A warm welcome to anyone who's just joined us to learn about the infant observation course that we run in the BPF. So to introduce myself a bit more fully, I'm co-chair of the infant observation course alongside Joanna. I work in private practice and also in the NHS in a therapeutic community in London, specialising in borderline personality disorder. And I can say that for me, this course, the infant observation course, alongside my personal analysis, was the most important part of my training. So for those of you who are trying to make the very difficult decision of which training to do, I mean, this course can stand alone. It's an introductory route into analytic skills. Before I go on, perhaps, Joanna, would you like to introduce yourself and I can start trying to share my slides?
Yes, so I am the co-chair of the Infant Observation Committee with Sally. I am a Jungian analyst and I'm in private practice in Oxford, full-time private practice. And I would basically completely echo what Sally has said about how fundamental an infant observation is to my way of thinking anyway, to basically any kind of work with somebody in a therapeutic way.
Thanks, Jo. Oops. I'm sharing the wrong thing here. There we go. So the presentation that I'm going to do will involve an overview of the course and also some information about the nitty-gritty of the skills involved. It's based on our colleague Janine Sternberg from BPF's book, which is entitled Infant Observation at the Heart of Psychoanalytic Training. Janine's not here today, but you can read the book. It's really interesting. So I'll first describe the method that we use. Then, as I said, nitty-gritty, and then finally we'll do a Q&A. So if you could put your questions into that as we go along, then Joanna and I will try to answer them at the end. So here's what it looks like in terms of the method. The infant observation involves a 1-hour weekly observation from birth to 2 years of a baby. Student goes along to the baby's home, observes the baby in their natural surroundings. The family don't make any changes. The student is sort of like a fly on the wall. In social anthropology, the term is participant observer. So by being in the room with the baby and its family, you can't be a fly on the wall. You're inevitably influencing the environment. But as much as possible, you try to stand back, to watch, to observe. So that happens for 1 hour a week. Then you come home, you write a transcript of everything you've seen. So every flicker of the baby's eyelashes, every tensing and opening of their fingers. Sometimes observers will observe a baby who's asleep for an hour. And that can also be fascinating. So you write everything down, phenomenological, that is what you see the baby doing, the noises baby's making, the movements, sounds, and affective, so the emotional component that you observe in the baby, the emotional temperature around it, and your own feelings. And when you've captured all that in detail, great detail, on paper, you have a weekly seminar group, which is a maximum of 5 people, and there'll be one presenter each week who presents those notes, presents their baby observation. And while they're presenting, there'll be another note taker who will take notes of, sorry, not while they're presenting, the presentation is made, Then there's a group discussion. The note taker will take notes of the group discussion. So going in a layer deeper. Each presenter in the group takes a turn. So every 5 weeks, it'll come back to your turn to present. The person who took the notes will introduce your baby. So there are layers and layers of analysis, and I'll go into the detail of that a bit later. And questions about finding the baby, I'm sure we'll get to those at the end. Joanna, do jump in if you feel that I've missed anything, or
yeah, I will.
At the end. So this type of observation, it's been referred to as a naturalistic observation. So it's not the kind of scientific study that comes up with information about the whole cohort of babies. Fascinating as they are, those kind of research studies are more like the two on the right. They start with a theory about infant behaviour and then go on to look at evidence that supports that. No, this is naturalistic observation in our seminar. And that's because it relates to the specific dyad, you and the infant, rather than to the whole cohort. So for those of you who've already done some analytic reading, I'm thinking about Bion's writing on learning about or learning from experience. So this infant observation course is an experiential course. It's you learning alongside the baby. So infant observation as training for psychoanalysts, it involves all of these things which are key to your further training, whichever course you decide to go on to. It involves looking without preconceptions, a particular way of observing, an intensity of emotions, abstinence, waiting for meaning, processing through writing, and the use of the seminar. And I'll go through each of these. It's worth pointing out also, I think, that the course attracts people who are going to do psychoanalytic training because it's a prerequisite for most courses and most child and adolescent courses. But it also, there's space for teachers, social workers, people who are just interested in the development of the mind in a baby. So you don't have to come from a psychoanalytic world to do this, but you do have to have a psychoanalytic attitude, as you'll see. Sorry, oops. I've got my slides a bit mixed up. Let's talk about the first slides. So looking without preconceptions, we have to acknowledge that observations are never neutral. We navigate life informed by our views, assumptions, values. And this infant observation, as I've said, runs within an institution whose underlying theory is that experiences from childhood and babyhood inform the development of our mind and carry reverberations through to adulthood. So even if you're not thinking of working with babies or children or adolescents, this course is helpful in working with adults, particularly when they're in a regressed state of mind or struggling to connect with pre-verbal emotions from their own early years. A particular way of observing, this is also a non-scientific, a non-scientific way, perhaps it's a very scientific way. We need to find a state of reverie to allow the feeling of being adrift, bearing uncertainty, of being in the dark. As in analysis, we need to be in a state of not knowing, of Keats' negative capability. And only when this state ends can we begin to try to make sense of it. So it's sort of counterintuitive, isn't it? We read all these theories, but actually in the room with a patient or in your infant observation in the room with a baby, you need to be in this state of not knowing. So reverie and feeling states are vital, but they also need to be balanced by critical thinking. But this thinking stage comes after the actual observation in the seminar group, when the whole group puts its mind towards what actually was happening in the mind of the baby. So Sternberg, in her book, writes of the extreme feelings an observer can experience while being with a baby, of how the observer's infantile feelings are aroused. The observer can feel envious of the mother-baby relationship or disturbed by the projective identification, the feelings transmitted from mother or infant. And Bick quotes Wittenberg as saying, "Being born into the role of observer is inevitably traumatic. We have all defended against deep infantile anxieties by idealizing babies and babyhood. To actually experience the baby's frequent falling apart, what agonies babies, mothers, and fathers go through, is always a shocking discovery for the inexperienced observer. Observers can defend against these feelings by idealizing the baby, blaming the parents, or retreating into theory and scientific thoughts." The pain of abstinence. Our challenge as observers is to be alongside raw, unprocessed affect and to bear it, not to act or to try to rescue the person from their feeling. In an infant observation, the pressure to do this is intense. Whilst, of course, if a baby is going to fall off the sofa or come to harm, then the observer exercises their humanity and their safeguarding responsibility and acts to protect them. But in most cases, the observer watches as mother and baby try to regulate the baby's state, with or without success. So you can be watching a crying baby. It can be painful. The learning comes from experiencing the emotion and containing it, and this is key to our work as analysts. Waiting for meaning. Sorry, Jo, go.
I was just going to add to that it's, I think this feeling of helplessness that you can often find yourself as an observer is and being able to bear your own helplessness in the face of a baby not stopping crying, for example. It sort of puts you in touch with an ability that will work for you then in the therapeutic room much later, that actually so much of it is about not being able to help and being able to bear that.
Thank you. So waiting for meaning to emerge, we stay in a state of reverie and of not knowing, as Jo said, for as long as possible. And Esther Bick emphasized the importance of the observer not jumping in with a word to describe something, but of patiently waiting for the phenomena and the word to emerge, to be as accurate as possible to the phenomenological experience. Martha Harris, in chapter 1 of the Tavistock training in philosophy, writes, "The observation experience helps the student to endure living in the question, as Keats puts it, with his patience, to struggle until he can discern the implications of his first-hand detailed impressions, rather than to flee to premature application of theory. It helps him to see the infant in both the child and the adult, and in his analytic work to stay with that infant and aid him in his arrested or distorted development." Processing through writing. Stage 2 of the observation process is for the observer to write up detailed notes. This can be difficult when describing pre-verbal states, feelings for which there are no adequate words. Sometimes observers find themselves thinking of art, poetry, music, body states to reflect on painful experiences from the observation. Then there's the detail of the phenomenological observations, finding the right description can be a struggle. When the baby came off the nipple, did he spit it out, drop it, slide away from it, let go of it, escape from the nipple? The wording over time can build up a picture of the baby's and of the observer's inner experience. And then also there's the interesting thing of what's left out of the writing, and that can often emerge in the seminar. And we're dealing with unconscious processes here, aren't we? Those can be fascinating insights into what's actually going on. The language of infant observation has been described then as that of science describing the phenomena of the outer world, and that of poetry, the experience of the inner. The use of the seminar. So we've got 5 participants in the seminar. We've also got their baby selves. We've got the babies they're observing. There are lots of babies, and baby feelings can arise in and amongst the group. We think of them in the context of the baby being observed. So our competitive or angry feelings being projectively identified by group members. Sometimes one group member will feel strongly about something and another will feel the opposite. Could this be reflecting the emergence of splitting in the baby's own mind? The wonderful thing is that we don't know for sure. We think together after the reverie has ended to try to feel into the baby's developing mind. And what we're developing as a prerequisite for all the further trainings is an analytic attitude. So the capacity to observe, to listen, to feel, to hold back from doing or saying anything, to resist acting, to develop a sense of reverie. Freud talked of this as evenly suspended attention, didn't he? Jung called it participation mystique. Winnicott talked about it as maternal preoccupation. It's that state where unconscious elements can emerge, which is the world that the infant lives in. We need to be able to reflect sometimes in an emotionally charged atmosphere. Could be painful, could be delightful. It could sometimes be for the observer resisting the urge to play with the infant. And then as the infant gets older, it's really interesting to see how the baby, the infant, uses the observer, how much they pull the observer into interacting. The general task is to sift through all of this and to try to work out whose feelings belong to whom. So, joining the course, I know there are people from all around the world on this open day, and I need to say at this point that the babies that we observe are UK babies. It's a UK course. The groups are all in various places in the UK. Some of them are in person, some of them are online. The online groups usually require attendance in person once or twice a year. In terms of time, I'm thinking of practical questions you might be asking. You'll need about half a day in total, I think, by the time you've had an hour to get to your baby, to observe the baby, another hour, sometimes more at the beginning, to write up these really detailed notes. And then an hour and a quarter seminar once a week, 10 times a term. In whichever place in the UK you are. As I say, some of them, the seminars are online, but you are required to observe the baby in person. We went online during COVID, and it was quite inspiring, actually, how keen the parents and the families were to continue the observations online once they'd built up the relationship with the observers, how used they were to that person coming once a week. And we had families offering to position laptops, mobile phones. One observer spent the hour in a cot alongside the baby, right up close, so observing every pulse, every flicker of the baby's eyelid. Another was put in a car seat on the parent's mobile phone and was carried upstairs and experienced the disorientation that perhaps the baby was feeling of being jiggled up the staircase and carried around. So we made it work during the pandemic, but now we're back to observing babies in person. The process for joining is that we have 2 interviews where we reflect with you on your readiness for doing this course. We suggest that if you're, if you're a parent of a baby up to 1, it's not the right course for you at that time. Having a baby is a hugely emotional experience, and you need to be open enough to reflect on all the things that I've talked about. So we'd have 2 interviews to reflect with you about where you're at, whether this is the right time for you to do an infant observation. We ask for references. We ask for a DBS check from the UK if you're in the UK, or if you've been outside, then the equivalent one from your country. You find a baby after joining the group, because finding the baby is part of the process within the group. You need the group mind to think with you about whether this family is right for you. We think very carefully about finding a stable enough family that you'll witness the ordinary development of a baby. So it needs to be somebody you don't know. It needs to be a stable family. It needs not to be somebody who's perhaps a single parent feeling isolated, hoping for support or some sort of therapeutic input from you, because that's not your role. So we think very carefully about the baby that you find. Find the baby after joining the group. You'll be supported in how to find a baby. Obviously, we don't have a supply of babies all around the UK, but you'll be guided in how to approach various organisations, how to talk to people about the search. The thing to do before joining the course is to find your therapist. And if you're going on to do a psychoanalytic training, then you'll need to find a psychoanalytic or Jungian BPC qualified therapist. And I've put the link at the bottom here for you to look at our web page to find further information. I was thinking, was there anything else? I think that's not going to show that. No, I think that's about it. So we could move into Q&A, perhaps take a couple of minutes to think about what your questions are. Joanna and I can think about any bits that I've missed out that you might need to know that will help you decide.
We've actually already got a few questions here.
Okay.
So some of them might have been sort of answered. So the first one here is this course possible for someone looking to fit it around a full-time job? Well, yes, it is completely possible to do it around a full-time job. But you need to have in mind that it takes, as Sally said, you need about half a day's worth of time. Now, obviously, that half a day could be later in the evening or something like that, so you can find it, but you do have to allow for that amount of time. There is no you don't need to make any time for reading theory, as I think it's probably really clear. This is not a theoretical course. It's very much an observational course, but there is a paper that you will write at the end. for those doing trainings with a BPF, that paper would be mandatory. For those from the outside, you don't have to do the paper, but it is advisable because it does really help you pull the whole experience together. And for that, you might well want to go to some theory. So we lightly touch theoretical concepts as we go on, but there's no time or required reading or anything like that.
Yeah. The next question is this infant observation course a prerequisite for Jungian analyst training, becoming a Jungian analyst? Yes, it is with the BPF, definitely.
Well, it's not actually prerequisite. You don't have to have done the infant observation before you apply for either the PPA, I'm pretty sure, and certainly the BJAA. But you do have to do an observation. And if you've done it beforehand, then that's great. And if not, you do it during your training.
Usually what happens is you don't get your first training patient on the analytic training until you've completed the infant observation. Yeah, so you could start it before, or perhaps at the same time as starting your analytic training. That would be a lot.
I think each of the different trainings have slightly different requirements with regard to how far you are through your infant observation, but you certainly will, at the very, very least, have had to have started to observe, and mostly you would have had to have done at least a year, if not the 2 years.
Yeah,
before taking training patient.
My personal journey was to do the infant observation, and I didn't know whether I actually wanted to go on and do the analytic training. I wasn't sure, so I looked on it as a module that would help with the therapy work that I was already doing. And then during the course, I decided I would apply and go on to do the analytic training.
Yes, a lot of people do that. They'll start on an infant observation, because you can start on an infant observation if you're thinking of doing a training. For example, some of you might have heard the PPA presentation before us, and you also might be wanting to really kind of bed into your own analysis. So it's something you can be doing alongside and then apply. So there's lots of different ways of doing it.
Sounds like the artistic perspective. Yes, it's both, isn't it? I mean, we carry in our heads the theories that we might have learnt about babies, even if it's only a thought of, oh, he should be walking or talking by now. But there's this state of reverie that's required which allows for artistic thoughts, musical thoughts, the place that we imagine a baby might be in, a place of image, sound. Don't know if you want to say any more on that, Jo.
Well, I think it's if you mean by the artistic perspective, something around really having to draw on one's imagination and interconnect that with thinking. It's not that they're too necessarily exclusive of one another, but it does. I think there is something of what might be called an artistic attitude.
Yeah. Next question. On average, how long do people spend in the observation group? 2 years plus however long it takes to find the baby. So about 2.5 years. It could be. It doesn't appear straight away, and finding the baby, it's a bit like getting pregnant. Some people find one immediately, some people wait, and that can be painful and involve introspection. You're already in your therapy before you join the group, so that's a personal journey that you're taking alongside and feeding into the infant observation. But yeah, it can take longer than the actual 2 years.
Yes. So allow for it for 2.5 years, but it might even take a bit longer. If you hadn't found a baby in a year, then we might want to be thinking with you about what's going on and whether you want to continue or not. But generally, 2.5 years, I think, is probably a good thing to kind of reckon on.
Mm. And
Somebody
Jill,
hears.
yeah,
Do you want to call it, Jill?
what happens if you go to observe the baby and they're asleep all the time?
You watch them. You watch the baby asleep. And you watch it sleep and you watch it sleep. If there was a situation, for example, where you find yourself always at the time when the baby sleeps, you might then want to think about that in the seminar group, and it might then be thought about whether it would be worth changing the time to see if to see the baby in a different place in the day. But generally, if the baby is asleep, you watch it. If the baby is awake, you watch it. You observe the baby, whatever it is doing.
Mm. On which day is the online group? From memory, Monday and Thursday evenings, but you can email to check about that.
Yeah, the groups actually run on different. There's about 5 or 6 groups currently, aren't there? And they all run on different times and different days. So once you've gone through the interview and been accepted, we would try to then match you with a group that fits what you can manage.
Do babies need to be observed same time, day of the week? What breaks are allowed? How many observation weeks a year are required? Jo, do you want to?
Yeah, so you do tend to try to observe the baby at the same time each week. Otherwise, it can get really quite unmanageable to change it each time. So generally, we encourage the observers to find a stable time with the family. Now, obviously, it's life circumstances happen, and it may well be that during the 2 years observation, you might find yourself having to change the time because, let's say that the child turns a certain age and goes to nursery. You wouldn't observe them in nursery, so then something else would have to another time would have to be found. That's an example, but generally we try to keep it the same time each week.
We're like a bridge between on the way to developing the analytic attitude. We're looking on it within the frame of therapy where you wouldn't change the time of the sessions. It would be contained in the same time every week. As Joanna said, you need to be practical sometimes when family circumstances change, but nothing happens before you've discussed it in the seminar group. So we all think about it together. But there was another part of that question. How many? Well, you're required to attend 80% of the seminars, and I don't think we have a number of weeks. People tend to, once they start the observation, to need to take holidays, but not to want to take too long, because you miss a lot in 2-3 weeks of a baby's life. But people do need to take holidays.
And the family do as well. Sometimes the family may go away, in which case it's not possible to observe. So what's this one? So if you do the observation beforehand, then it is credited to for the Jungian training. And is this a better way to go about it? Well, the second part of the question, it's not necessarily the better way. But yes, if you did do the BPF course, infant observation course, then that would count as your infant observation for the Jungian, any of the Jungian trainings. There's 3 different ones, and they all require a 2-year infant observation. Whether it's the better way to go about it, I think that's a personal thing, really. People do it in many different ways. But as we sort of touched on, there is a timing issue in the sense that you have to have completed a year or have just started your observation, depending on which Jungian training you want to do, before you would be allowed to take on a training patient. So if you haven't done an infant observation beforehand, then you would want to be looking to do the infant observation when you start the training, so that you will have completed enough of it so that you can see a training patient.
The next one's about what happens if a fight breaks out between the parents. We're all responsible, aren't we, in terms of safeguarding? If we think that a child or an infant is going to come to harm, then we have to do something. And if it's a violent fight, I mean, I'm thinking from the worst scenario, you just call the police. If it's an everyday argument, this is again where the seminar group is helpful. You'd write it all up. We would think carefully about it. If we thought it was a safeguarding concern, then your seminar group leader would advise you what steps were needed.
I think that's really important to emphasize the seminar group and the seminar leader's role, because all sorts of anxieties can get provoked when you do an observation. And it's, if you start to take it upon yourself as being a kind of safeguarding person, that can really be very troublesome for you and really for the family too. So unless there is actually, as Sally sort of imagined, something really quite obviously very dangerous going on, which generally there isn't, because we already discuss the family before you even start with the observation. But if there are concerns, then these are discussed in the seminar group first, including things like safeguarding, if that does come up. And there's various different escalating routes that the seminar leader will know about if that is necessary. So in other words, the observer, as well as the family, are basically protected so that the observer can do what they are there to do, which is observe, not judge, not psychotherapize, just observe.
Yeah, not to pathologize the parents.
Yes.
Or the parent for everyday normal things that happen.
Yeah. Which is what your quote that you read out, Sally, refers to. How often the pull to pathologize or to judge the parents is an indicator that something is really quite difficult to process for yourself. What are the ethics of observing the family, baby of a family you already have a relationship with? We say no to that. If you know the family, you can't observe their infant. So there needs to be one step between you, at least one step between you and the family the baby you will be observing. So a friend of a friend is fine. Often that's the best way. You can get your friends to sort of be your ambassador, so to speak. That's in some ways the best way to find a baby, because somebody can actually vouch for you as being a good person, and it'll be fine for you to come into their home. But actually observing someone, baby you know, or the family you know, or even you're related to, that's not okay.
Boundaries are something that you in depth and at length on any kind of training, and this is a strong one.
Yeah,
you'd be given
it's also because
introduction from BPF to introduce you once you've had your DBS checks and references, and once you're in the group.
There's also, if you're observing a family that you know, a baby that you know, your boundaries, your actual role becomes incredibly blurred. Like, are you there as a friend, or are you there as an observer? And it's difficult enough to negotiate those boundaries. But in the situations described here, it wouldn't be ethical for the observer or the family to have to manage that.
Looking at any other questions, why doesn't the psychodynamic training ask for an infant observation course? Good question. I'm sure it would help with it. but it's not part of the shape of the design of that course. And in fact, some analytic training courses in other institutions don't ask for infant observation, and there was a debate for the academic ones amongst you between Andre Green and Daniel Stern about the merits of an infant observation. In some places it's not valued as highly, but I think for our BPF it is. It's a fundamental part. But yeah, it's not.
And how is... Sorry, I thought you'd finished, Sally.
Yeah.
So how is the baby or the family's privacy protected with written observations and discussions? So all of the when they're passed around, often nowadays they are passed online, they have to be password protected, and parents and child are their names, their actual names are not written down. Often it's just the first initial. The family's address and contact details are held centrally by Sandra Pereira, who is the course administrator, in case of any kind of an emergency. But other than that, nobody knows where these people live, where they are, except of course the observer.
Yeah, that's really important, isn't it? The privacy of the family. And in the writing of the final paper, names are anonymized. Any information that might identify a family is taken out of any final paper. If you did publish your paper, then that would only ever be at the consent of the parents, because that's not the deal that you go into with this observation. The deal is that they agree to you observing their baby, to learning, and that's it for 2 years. Is there another question?
I thought I saw one coming up in the chat, but I'm not sure.
It is just about time to wrap up. We've got a couple of minutes left, so time for one more question if you want to, or we can go into the lunch break.
Mm-hmm. Does anybody have another question that they want to put into the Q&A?
There's one that's just popped up there.
Okay. Oh, yes. Here we go. I'm going to read this out. Everything is gestation and then bringing forth. To let each impression and each germ of feeling come to completion wholly in itself, in the dark, in the inexpressible, the unconscious, beyond the reach of one's own intelligence, and await with deep humility and patience in the birth hour of a new clarity. Is this you speaking? Oh, Rilke, good old Rilke. Alone is living the artist's life. So perhaps you're also speaking to that earlier comment. In understanding and in creating, being an artist means not reckoning and counting, but ripening. Sorry, my eyes aren't so good. I can't read this. It's very small. But ripening, like the tree which does not force its sap and stands confident in the storms of spring without fear that after them may come no summer.
That's a perfect way to end this. Thank you very much, Fiona. I think that finishes our talk very nicely. Thank you, everybody. I think it's time for lunch.
Yeah.
Over to Francis.